Hello everyone and welcome to your first English Literature Poetry video lesson. So these lessons are going to be a series of short videos containing information and activities for you to carry out, and they are going to be designed to help you to understand and get to grips with 3 poems from the AQA Power and Conflict cluster. So each of these poems is connected by the fact that they think about and talk about power and conflict in different ways. Now, throughout these lessons, not only will you be learning about the poems themselves, but you'll also be picking up skills that will allow you to understand and get to grips with other poems in the future. So you're not just learning about the poems today, you're learning about how to read poetry in general. Each lesson is going to be built around a single learning question. It will also feature some key vocabulary that's going to really help you to understand what I'm talking about. And there will be several activities throughout each one. At the end of each sequence of videos, you will complete a piece of assessed work to submit to your teacher. And over the course of this half term, you will complete 3 pieces of work in total. So we'll begin. Our first poem is Remains by Simon Armitage. And we are first of all asking the question, how can I begin to understand a poem's subject and focus? How can I get to grips with what a poet was thinking about when they wrote it and what they wanted me to think about when I read it? Let's kick off with some vocabulary that's going to help us with our understanding. Context. The circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, idea, and in terms of which can be fully understood. And what that means is, if you think about the poet Wilfred Owen, who wrote poetry about World War I, his context was as a soldier in that conflict. He was there fighting in the trenches. So he wrote about the world he understood. He wrote about his experiences as a soldier. His context was the war and the trenches. John Agard's context is of a man who grew up in British Guyana. He's a Guyanese citizen. And he grew up in a country that was occupied by British colonial forces. So as a black man, he was a second-class citizen in his own country. And when he writes his poetry and when he writes the poem Checking Out Me History, he is exploring what it means to not fully own your own history. So the context is the influences and the surrounding setting that a poet is thinking about. Connotations are an idea or feeling that a word or image creates for the person reading or hearing it, and that's in addition to its primary meaning. So this can be a symbol or it can be a word, and it has many ideas attached to it. So a classic example is a gun. Now this could symbolize protection, threat, death, power, war, freedom. If you're an American and you believe that you have the freedom to bear arms, this gun can mean all those things to different people, and different things to the same people in different situations. If you're holding a gun, it might make you feel powerful. If you're having a gun pointed at you, you may feel threatened. A gun can represent all of these things. Those are its connotations. The word love, depending on your experience, you might think of romantic love, you might think of parental love or caring love, you may even think of heartbreak and the loss of love. So when we go through our activities today, I want you to really keep thinking about connotations and think about how meaning is linked to words and what your personal experience brings. And so here we are, activity 1, word association. The title of the poem is Remains, and the title is as good a place as any to start. So we'll begin by thinking about what could this be about? What might the poem called Remains actually be about? What do I know about this word? What definitions, what images does it create in my head? And you are going to pause the video and make a mind map. Take 2 minutes to do that, writing down all of the connections that you can think of before that 2 minutes is up. So you can do that now, and then we'll come back and we'll have a look at some ideas. Now, here's some pictures that represent some of the more common things that pop up when we do this activity in classes. Number 1, remains as in human remains, a body, a skeleton, death, perhaps. Remains, however, it's not just a noun, a name for something, it's also a verb. If something stays where it is and won't move, it remains. The blood here remains on the person's hands, no matter how hard they try to wash it away. Lady Macbeth there, maybe. This soldier remains at his post. He stays where he is and will not move. Here are the remains of what looks like quite a big party. This is rubbish. Remains might refer to things left behind, unwanted, discarded. So these are all different connotations, different ideas attached to the word remains. And this should start us thinking already about what this poem might be about. Is it related to death, to abandonment, to loss, or to being stuck, perhaps? Now let's take that a bit deeper with activity 2, which is all about looking at the language of the poem itself and making some predictions, some connections, and some connotations, that magic word again. So if you look at each of these words, they're separated out in circles, but actually you can find connections between these words. We call those semantic fields in poetry. Semantics means meaning, so these are fields of meaning, words connected by having similar or connected meanings. You are going to pause the video and you are going to make notes about connections that you spot between the words here and any predictions that this causes you to make about what this poem will be about. So take 3 minutes to do that. These notes can be rough, it's just for your benefit, but make sure that you do have something written down before you restart the video, because after this I'll be taking you through some of the more common ideas that tend to pop up. And here we are ready to look at those common ideas that I promised we'd discuss. Now, you have a personal response to this poem already in the connections that you spotted with those words, and it's very hard to tell somebody that their personal interpretation isn't correct. But if you don't have any of the things that I highlight now, then please make sure you write them down, because these are the most commonly found connections and they really do help us to understand the poem. First of all then, the words pain, bloody and torn jump out to me as being connected because they have all to do with violence and suffering and damage, and they suggest to me that this poem is going to be occupied with those ideas. I also found a quite contrasting collection of words, sleep, home and mates, which to me speak of comfort and happiness. And so I see a contrast here and I wonder, maybe is this poem going to be exploring the difference between these two things? And the third thing I notice are enemy and raiding, which have connotations of danger and of opposition. So again, I can see contrasts and I can see links between the red and the yellow circles too. So is this poem perhaps about fighting, protecting something, being under threat? Now, that remains to be seen, of course, but these are ideas that I can bring to the poem and look for and spot. Now, moving on, we're going to learn a little bit about the poet and then the poem, and this will help us hopefully to understand where this poem might be taking us and what it might be doing. So Simon Armitage, a Yorkshire-born poet who's also written novels, radio, TV, film scripts, and is the current Poet Laureate of Britain, which basically means he's the chief poet. He is recognised as one of the very best of our current writers who can use poetry in a way that very few others can. Now, Simon Armitage is a storyteller. He loves to explore different people's lives and experiences, and his poetry is often based on real events and real people. And because of that, he frequently uses the dramatic monologue form. So a monologue is a single person speaking, and a dramatic monologue is a scene in which a person speaks and reveals something about their character or about themselves or about their emotions. So the poem that we will read is a dramatic monologue. It comes from the collection The Not Dead, and that was written in 2007 in conjunction with Channel 4, and it's a series of poems based on the real experiences of soldiers who came home from war physically and mentally changed or damaged, and that's where the title comes from. They're not so much alive as just not dead. They all came back changed. This particular poem is based on a true story about Robert Tromans of the Irish Guards, and this is a still clip from the documentary itself. This is Guardsman Tromans. He served in Basra, Iraq during the Gulf War in 2002, and this poem tells a story from that time. It's told from his perspective as if he is speaking the words, and we call this the voice of the poem. So when we talk about the writer using the voice of the poem, we've got to remember that Simon Armitage was never a soldier, was never in Basra, and he's writing a story in the character of the soldier. The story itself is that Guardsman Tromans and his squad spent many months patrolling an area under constant violence, constant threat of violence and death, a really stressful situation. And on one of those patrols in Basra, he and 2 others shot a looter who was stealing from a bank, fearing but not knowing if the man was armed. The man was horrifically wounded and he was taken away. Drowsman Drones never found out what the man's fate was. He was haunted by what he did and the violence that he'd seen, and was forced to pass that same spot every day on patrol, so he relived this idea time and time again. This led to him developing post-traumatic stress disorder, and upon his return home, he turned to drink and drugs in an attempt to deal with his feelings. The army offered him very little help. There was no psychiatric help and no assistance for his mental health, and he spiraled very, very much out of control. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a result of experiencing or witnessing a life-threatening event, car crash, combat, or constant stress as a situation such as bullying. It's normal to experience some symptoms after a traumatic event, but if they don't go away over time, then that is post-traumatic stress disorder. And those symptoms can be reliving of the event through nightmares and flashbacks, having negative changes in beliefs and feelings that cause paranoia, depression, and feeling constantly on edge and having extreme reactions to normal things. If you don't get the therapy and the specialist support that you need as a serious PTSD sufferer, very often your life will begin to spiral out of control. And those who have PTSD very often experience violent behavior. They suffer from depression, substance abuse is common, relationships fall apart, jobs are lost, homelessness is not uncommon, and suicide can be the final destination for many people who aren't able to get help for their mental health. So it's no wonder that Simon Armitage felt this was an important subject to talk about in his poem. So the final thing for you to do from this section of the video's activities is to go back over the two pieces of notes that you've made already, and using what you know now from the context that we've just been over, and go back over that and skip the video back and look at it again if you need to. Add extra notes to your first two activities. Use the context and give it some extra depth, and maybe add in some new ideas now that you know what it's about. Once that's done, and you give yourself about 3 minutes for that, once that's done, you are finished for this video and you can move on to the next one as soon as you were ready. Thank you very much, and I'll see you for part 2 very soon.